Embodies a Coaching Mindset has probably seen the most changes in the new release of the competencies. The context around who am I as a coach, the being of the coach, how do I show up as my whole self within my system and then the client's system, and being able to distinguish between the two. How do I manage my bias? These are all the questions that are coming up when we look at the coach mindset competency. All the thoughts that influence my interaction with a client. I want to be able to create a lot of mindfulness around the energy and the self that I'm bringing to the session. In Coach Academy community and in our programs, we often say that the coach is the instrument and the coach is the self. And so what self are we bringing to our coaching, and what do we want to bring? So there's the natural stance of you as the coach, and then it's the intentionality behind it. And I think that the biggest change for this competency has really been around intentionality. How do we intentionally create a practice with best practices embedded in it to continually increase our knowledge, not only about coaching competencies and coaching skills, but also our peripheral knowledge around the awareness of the client's context, the cultural implications, also technology, AI. How is AI implicated into coaching now? The ethical practices that we need to consider around AI. And that brings us back to the ethical practices of coaching in general. So, what is influencing the conversation? What is influencing the coach as a professional? And how do we create awareness and intentionality around the role of the coach? So, with coach mindset, what's most important to emphasize is the bias that a coach brings into a conversation. By bias, we mean those implicit biases that we are not aware of. Confirmation bias, recency bias are two examples of how we may be influencing what we hear, what we pay attention to, what we listen for from a coaching conversation. So, this competency is really extending what it means to be in the coach mindset when we think about what influences us, how we interact in the conversation, and how coaches must own their own awareness, take measures and actions to increase their own awareness. Another area of emphasis, or another important area to consider when it comes to coaching mindset, is emotions. How do we manage our emotions in a coaching session? Instead of manage, the word used to be regulate in the old competency. They've switched it to manage, I believe, because coaches are meant to show up authentically, transparently, and with connection as a goal for the conversation. By connection, I mean being present, partnering, and being willing to coach from another person's belief systems. Our emotions will be a factor as coaches because we're human. Our emotions also make us human, and that differentiates us from AI. And so it's an important part, but we also want to know that we want to manage our emotional contributions to coaching and help clients also manage their emotions. What impact do their emotions have on their decision making, on their behaviors, on how they're seeing a situation, and the perspective that they take from that situation? Because we know that emotions impact how we see situations and experience them. Emotions also point to well-being, well-being of the coach, well-being of the client. So coaches are required to work on maintaining emotional and mental well-being before and after a session, because we know that what clients share with us may affect us as coaches. So a clearing process after a coaching session is always a good idea. Coaches are affected by their clients. It's normal to do so. what we want is to, again, be intentional about what are we going to do with that information. How does that conversation impact you, the coach? And what are you willing to do to clear that energy to move on to the next client or just to move on in your day? So we think a lot about, from a coach mindset perspective, cultivating practices that help us stay clean with our coaching and become aware of our thoughts and behaviors and how they influence us as coaches. And another important emphasis or another important factor in coach mindset is openness. Willingness to stay open to what emerges in a conversation, to nurture that openness with curiosity. And that is really one of the biggest challenges as coaches, because we often show up wanting to tell, wanting to fix, and wanting to save. So when we stay and nurture curiosity, that means we're stepping out of judgment to inquiry. Getting curious means asking good questions, open questions, leaning into another person's experience. That means really honoring what's happening for someone without relating to it and staying, in that clean zone where you are objective and witnessing the client as opposed to solutioning for the client. We also want to think of it from a systemic context point of view, where we're bringing the context of the entire person to light in a session. We want to ensure that we see the cultural context, the gender context, the identity of the client is multi-layered, and we want to be able to create space where all of that is allowed to show itself and is really able to be seen, to dance, to come alive in that coaching session. So when we think about coach mindset, we think about cultivating the mindset of being in service to the client. And the question then becomes, how do I need to be as the coach to be in service to a client? So coach mindset in everyday coaching looks a little bit nuanced, actually, because curiosity is the key, and every coaching conversation is different. So when we know that the coach mindset is present, we know that first and foremost, the coach is leading with inquiry, that they are mindful of their agenda and that they are managing or self-managing that agenda. And by agenda, I mean, do I want the client to succeed? Are my questions leading the client to success? Or am I more open and willing to explore all the aspects that are emerging for the client, all of the different layers of emotion and complexity the client brings? So being aware of your agenda is a big part. And we all have an agenda. It's not that we're trying not to have an agenda, it's that we are aware of it and self-managing it. That's the goal. What do you want for the client? That's a really good question to ask yourself as a coach, because that want or desire for your client will influence how you show up to the conversation. What are you triggered by? How might you be relating to the client? We have to ask ourselves these questions to raise awareness about our own response to the client and how that response may be influencing the direction that we take the conversation. Also, another one which is important that we talk a lot about at Coach Academy is resisting to be the cheerleader in the conversation. When we're truly upholding a coach mindset, we aren't there to validate, we're there to acknowledge. And we're not there to cheerlead, we're there to appreciate. And so what impact are all of these things, that you're bringing into a conversation? The coach mindset kind of takes them all together and says, what impact am I having on the client? And how do I want to be in this conversation to uphold the standards of the ICF coaching? And at Coach Academy, we talk a lot about the principle of showing up to the client where the client is and not where we want them to be. When a coach is truly embodying the coach mindset, they are visibly partnering meaning you can really hear that there's no hierarchy in the conversation. And partnering sounds like it should be 50-50, but in fact, it's 80-20. 20% of the work is done by the coach, 80% is done by the client. And that means that the coach is really sitting in a supportive stance that leads with wondering, that leads with objectivity, as opposed to knowing and assuming, which is how we typically show up to conversations. The coach is managing their own bias and judgments with strategic interventions. For example, they may be echoing versus paraphrasing, or they may be asking open-ended inquiry versus closed-ended questions, or they're practicing acknowledgments versus validation. They're learning to linger and to allow time to think versus crosstalk and interrupting. So there's many strategic ways that we can uphold coach mindset, and it becomes very visible and we can hear it in very skilled coaching conversations. When a coach struggles with embodying a coach mindset, typically what you'll hear is an inappropriate expression of emotion, not meeting the client where they are, but bringing the client to where you are as the coach. You could hear cheerleading, validations, things like, I love that, or great job with that. These are nice things to bring into conversation, but in a coaching conversation, they're considered validations because they may influence the way or direction a client takes with their thinking. So we want to allow space and time to think, and anything that interrupts that would be where a coach is trying too hard to lead the conversation or to do too much work in the conversation. That's when you start to see the balance in the coaching go from an 80-20 principle, which is 20% coach, 80% client, to more of a 50-50, or maybe even reversing the tables where the coach is doing 80% of the talking and the client is doing 20%. If there's any sharing of opinions, sharing of judgments, showing a bias, anything like that would be considered not embodying the coaching mindset. So first and foremost, we really need to consider how the coaching is conducted from the sense of a non-directional, non-judgmental position. Bottom line, what's important about embodying a coach mindset is cultivating the awareness that it takes to know that you are embodying the coach mindset. It's all about self-awareness. It's all about, how do I want to show up? What's the intentionality? When we think about intentionality, we think about investing in ourselves, in our practice, to keep showing up to the conversation confident, with strategy and with qualified approaches. That's why it's so important to consider qualified coaching versus unqualified coaching. Qualified coaching teaches us how to show up to uphold the ethical standard of coach mindset, which is truly that non-directive position. We often, I've already mentioned, in our Coach Academy community, we talk about do no harm as a coach. That means that advice is not part of coaching. And that can be a really tough thing to unlearn, which is why we put so many supportive structures around that unlearning process in our Coach Academy community. But for now, think about the intentionality you bring to the coach mindset and how you really need to embed it in your practice, and that we never actually arrive at a coach mindset. It's something you cultivate over time continuously. I'm an MCC level coach. I've been doing this for over 15 years, and I know that I continuously need to go back to cultivating coach mindset and to be very mindful of my practice to be able to uphold the standard that I would like to uphold.